The nurse's shoes squeaked against the cracked linoleum as she led me deeper into what Marcus had called the most advanced treatment facility in the region. But something felt wrong. The hallways were too dim, the equipment looked decades old, and I hadn't seen another patient since we'd arrived. When I asked about the strange silence, Marcus squeezed my hand and whispered, "They specialize in privacy here, Elena. You'll get the best care." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That's when I noticed the discharge papers in his briefcase were already signed. My name, his signature, dated for tomorrow. My hands trembled as the realization hit me like ice water through my veins. He wasn't trying to save me. He was trying to speed up my death. 3 months earlier, I had been living what I thought was a charmed life. Elena Rodriguez, married to Marcus Chen for 8 years, living in our beautiful Tudor home in Maplewood Heights, working as a freelance graphic designer, trying for our first child. Marcus was everything I thought I wanted in a husband. Successful cardiac surgeon, thoughtful, romantic, always surprising me with little gestures that made me feel like the luckiest woman alive. When he brought me flowers every Friday, when he insisted on cooking dinner after his long hospital shifts, when he talked about our future children with such tenderness, I felt like I was living in a fairy tale. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning in September. Stage 2 breast cancer, aggressive but treatable, the oncologist had assured me. Dr. Patricia Williams at Riverside Medical Center was confident, experienced, and had walked me through the treatment plan with such clarity that I'd left feeling scared but hopeful. Surgery first, then chemotherapy, then radiation. A long road, but one that led to recovery for most women in my situation. Marcus had been my rock during that first appointment. He'd held my hand throughout the consultation, asked all the right questions about treatment options and survival rates, and had even taken notes on his phone like the dedicated physician he was. On the drive home, he'd pulled over at our favorite coffee shop and bought me a vanilla latte with extra whipped cream, remembering that I'd mentioned craving it earlier that week, despite my usual preference for black coffee. "We're going to fight this together," he'd said, his dark eyes serious behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "You're not alone in this, Elena. I'm going to research every treatment option, every specialist, every clinical trial. We'll beat this thing." The first few weeks of treatment at Riverside were exactly what Dr. Williams had promised. The surgical team was professional and caring, the nursing staff knew my name and always checked on my comfort level, and the facility itself was modern and clean. Marcus drove me to every appointment, waited in the family room during procedures, and always had my favorite smoothie ready for the ride home when I was feeling nauseous from the medications. But then things started to change in ways that seemed subtle at first. Marcus began questioning Dr. Williams' approach during our appointments, suggesting that perhaps we should seek a second opinion. Not unusual for a concerned spouse, especially one with medical training. He started bringing medical journals to show me, highlighting studies about alternative treatment approaches, talking about cutting-edge therapies that weren't yet available at mainstream hospitals. "Elena, I've been doing research," he'd said one evening as I lay on the couch recovering from my latest chemotherapy session. "There are some incredible breakthroughs happening in experimental oncology. Places that are achieving remarkable results with approaches that traditional hospitals haven't adopted yet." I'd been too tired to engage deeply with his enthusiasm that night, but he'd continued bringing me articles and research papers, explaining complex medical terminology in ways I could understand, painting a picture of treatment options that sounded almost miraculous. According to Marcus, there were specialized facilities that combined traditional Western medicine with innovative techniques that were showing extraordinary success rates. "The problem with places like Riverside," he'd explained while I sipped ginger tea to settle my stomach, "is that they're bound by conventional protocols. They can't think outside the box, but there are physicians out there who are pioneers, who are willing to take calculated risks for exceptional outcomes." Dr. Williams had been pleased with my progress during my 6-week follow-up. The surgery had been successful, and my body was responding well to the chemotherapy. The side effects were manageable, and all indicators suggested I was on the right track for a full recovery. She'd scheduled my next round of treatments and mentioned that if everything continued going this well, We might be able to reduce the intensity of the chemotherapy sooner than originally planned. But when I'd shared this positive news with Marcus that evening, his reaction had surprised me. Instead of the relief and celebration I'd expected, he'd seemed almost disappointed. He'd questioned whether Dr. Williams was being overly optimistic, whether she was really pushing aggressive enough treatment protocols, whether we should be satisfied with standard care when there were revolutionary options available. "Elena, I need you to trust me on this," he'd said, sitting beside me on our bed that night. "I've been in contact with a colleague who runs a specialized oncology program. It's not widely known because they're selective about their patients, but their success rates are extraordinary. They're willing to take you on." The way he described this mysterious facility had sounded almost too good to be true. Personalized treatment protocols designed specifically for each patient's genetic markers. Revolutionary immunotherapy techniques that weren't yet approved by the FDA, but were showing incredible results in private trials. A level of individualized care that mainstream hospitals simply couldn't provide due to their size and bureaucratic constraints. "Where is this place?" I'd asked, curious about why I'd never heard of such an amazing facility in our area. "It's about 3 hours north, near Cedar Falls," Marcus had replied. "They maintain a low profile intentionally. Too much publicity would compromise their ability to operate with the flexibility that makes them so effective." Something about his explanation had felt off to me, but I'd attributed my unease to the mental fog that came with chemotherapy. Marcus was a respected physician, with connections throughout the medical community. If he'd found a treatment option that could improve my chances of recovery, shouldn't I trust his expertise? Over the next few days, Marcus had become increasingly insistent about this alternative treatment facility. He'd shown me testimonials from former patients, though when I'd asked to speak with some of them directly, he'd explained that confidentiality agreements prevented direct contact. He'd presented research data that suggested their innovative protocols were achieving recovery rates significantly higher than traditional approaches. "The thing is, Elena," he'd said during one of our conversations about the facility, "they have a waiting list, but my colleague can get you in next week if we commit soon. This kind of opportunity doesn't come along often." I'd asked if we could visit the facility first, meet the physicians, see the treatment areas. But Marcus had explained that their security protocols didn't allow for preliminary visits. Patients were only admitted after a complete medical review and formal acceptance into their program. It was all or nothing. Dr. Williams had been skeptical when I'd mentioned the possibility of transferring my care to another facility. She'd asked for details about the program, the physicians involved, the specific treatment protocols they were proposing. When I'd shared what little information Marcus had provided, her concern had been evident. "Elena, I've never heard of this facility," she'd said gently, "and some of the treatments your husband is describing don't align with any current best practices in oncology. I'd strongly recommend that you ask for more concrete information before making any decisions about transferring your care." But Marcus had been prepared for Dr. Williams' skepticism. That evening, he'd explained that traditional oncologists often felt threatened by innovative approaches that challenged their established methods. He'd suggested that her resistance was more about protecting her own reputation than about my best interests. "She's invested in keeping you in her system, Elena," he'd said while making dinner in our kitchen. "That's how these hospital networks operate. They don't want patients to discover that there are better options available elsewhere." The pressure had been subtle but constant. Marcus had brought home more research, more testimonials, more urgency about the limited window of opportunity to join this exclusive program. He'd talked about how much he'd regret it if we missed this chance, and my condition worsened while receiving conventional treatment. "I can't live with myself if I don't explore every possible option for you," he'd said one night as we watched television together. "This could be the difference between recovery and..." He'd trailed off, but the implication had been clear. Finally, worn down by his persistence, and frightened by the possibility that I might be missing out on superior treatment, I'd agreed to transfer my care to the mysterious facility. Marcus had been overjoyed, immediately making phone calls to arrange the transition, gathering my medical records, and scheduling our departure for the following Monday. The drive to Cedar Falls had taken us through increasingly rural countryside. As we'd traveled further from civilization, Marcus had become more animated, talking excitedly about the personalized treatment plan that awaited me, the innovative physicians I'd be working with, the comfortable accommodations where I'd stay during my intensive treatment period. "You're going to love Dr. Richardson," he'd said as we'd driven through a particularly desolate stretch of farmland. He's a visionary. Trained at Johns Hopkins, but left traditional medicine because he was frustrated by the limitations of conventional protocols. When we'd finally reached our destination, my first impression had been confusion. The building looked nothing like the state-of-the-art medical facility Marcus had described. It was an old, institutional structure that appeared to have been abandoned for years. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds, several windows were boarded up, and there was no signage indicating that this was any kind of active medical facility. "Are you sure this is the right place?" I'd asked as Marcus parked near the main entrance. "It's intentionally low-key," he'd replied, but I'd noticed a slight tension in his voice. "They don't want to attract attention from competitors or regulatory agencies that might try to shut down their innovative programs." A woman in scrubs had met us at the entrance, introducing herself as Nurse Patricia. She'd been friendly but vague when I'd asked questions about the facility, the other patients, or the treatment protocols. She'd led us through dimly lit corridors that smelled of disinfectant and decay, past rooms that appeared empty and unused.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Where are all the other patients?" I'd asked as we'd walked through the eerily quiet building. "Most of our patients prefer privacy during their treatment," Nurse Patricia had replied. "We maintain very low patient loads to ensure individualized attention." Something about her answer had felt rehearsed, but Marcus had squeezed my hand reassuringly and explained that the exclusive nature of the program meant they only treated a few patients at a time. "Quality over quantity," he'd said. We'd been shown to a small room that was supposed to be where I'd stay during my treatment. It was sparse and institutional, with a narrow bed, a small table, and a single window that looked out onto an empty field. The bathroom was down the hall, shared with other rooms that appeared to be vacant. "When will I meet Dr. Richardson?" I'd asked, as Nurse Patricia had shown me where I could store my belongings. "He'll be conducting your intake evaluation this afternoon," she'd replied. "But first, we need to complete some paperwork and get you settled in." It was while Nurse Patricia had been showing me around the facility that I'd noticed Marcus talking quietly with someone near the main desk. I couldn't hear their conversation, but something about his body language had seemed strange. He'd been gesturing toward me, and the other person had been taking notes on a clipboard. When I'd approached them, Marcus had quickly ended his conversation and turned to me with a bright smile. "Just getting the administrative details sorted out," he'd said. "These places have to be very careful about their documentation." But I'd caught a glimpse of the papers on the clipboard, and what I'd seen had made my blood run cold. At the top of the page, I'd seen my name, followed by what looked like discharge paperwork. The date was listed as the next day, and there was a signature that looked remarkably like Marcus's handwriting. "Marcus," I'd said quietly, pulling him aside. "What was that paperwork about?" "What do you mean?" He'd replied, but his eyes hadn't met mine. "The discharge papers." Why would they already be preparing discharge paperwork when I haven't even started treatment yet? Marcus had looked genuinely confused, or at least he'd put on a convincing performance of confusion. "Discharge papers?" "Elena, I think the stress and medication might be affecting your perception. That was just standard intake documentation." But I knew what I'd seen: my name, tomorrow's date, and what had clearly been discharge paperwork already signed and ready to process. Why would a facility that was supposed to be providing me with cutting-edge treatment already be planning my departure before my treatment had even begun? The rest of that afternoon had passed in a haze of growing unease. Dr. Richardson had never appeared for the promised intake evaluation. Nurse Patricia had explained that he'd been called away for an emergency but would see me first thing in the morning. The other staff members I'd encountered had been vague and evasive when I'd asked questions about the treatment protocols or the facility's credentials. As evening had approached, Marcus had announced that he needed to return home to handle some urgent matters at the hospital where he worked, but that he'd be back to check on me in a few days. He'd kissed me goodbye and promised that I was in excellent hands, that this was the beginning of my recovery. But as I'd watched him drive away from my window, leaving me alone in this strange, empty facility, I'd felt a growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. The pieces weren't adding up. The abandoned appearance of the building, the lack of other patients, the pre-signed discharge papers, the mysterious absence of the head physician, and Marcus's eagerness to leave me here alone. That night, as I'd lain in the narrow bed listening to the strange sounds of the old building settling around me, I'd begun to put together a horrifying possibility. What if this wasn't a cutting-edge treatment facility at all? What if Marcus had brought me here for an entirely different purpose? The thought that had kept me awake until dawn was too terrible to fully accept, but too logical to ignore. My husband, the man who'd promised to love and protect me through sickness and health, might have just delivered me to a place where I was supposed to die. And if that was true, then everything I'd believed about our marriage, about his love for me, about the life we'd built together, was nothing more than an elaborate lie. As the first light of morning had crept through my small window, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to wait around to find out whether my suspicions were correct. Whatever was happening here, whatever Marcus's real intentions were, I needed to get out of this place and find out the truth. My life might depend on it. The morning light filtering through the grimy window cast long shadows across the institutional room where I had spent the most terrifying night of my life. Every creak of the old building had sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. Every distant sound had made me wonder if someone was coming for me. But as dawn broke, bringing with it a strange clarity, I began to piece together the horrifying puzzle that my marriage had become. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, my mind racing through memories that now carried entirely different meanings. The way Marcus had been so eager to find alternative treatment options, how he'd dismissed Dr. Williams' positive prognosis, his insistence that conventional medicine wasn't aggressive enough. At the time, I'd interpreted his behavior as the desperate love of a devoted husband. Now, those same actions felt like the calculated moves of someone with a very different agenda. My hands trembled as I remembered our last conversation with Dr. Williams. She'd been optimistic about my response to treatment, mentioning that my latest blood work showed significant improvement. But Marcus had questioned every positive indicator, suggesting that the doctor was being overly hopeful, that we couldn't trust such encouraging reports without seeking more aggressive intervention. "Elena, hope is dangerous when it prevents us from pursuing the most effective treatment," he'd said in the car afterward. "Dr. Williams is a good doctor, but she's conservative. She's not thinking about cutting-edge options that could make the difference between life and death." Now I understood why he'd been so dismissive of good news. My recovery wasn't part of his plan. The realization hit me like a physical blow, leaving me gasping for air in the stale atmosphere of the abandoned room. My husband hadn't brought me here to save my life. He'd brought me here to end it. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. 3 months ago, around the time of my diagnosis, Marcus had suggested we update our life insurance policies. It had seemed reasonable at the time, a responsible thing to do when facing a serious illness. He'd handled all the paperwork, explaining that as a physician, he understood the medical terminology and could ensure we got the best coverage. "Elena, we need to make sure you're properly protected," he'd said while reviewing the documents at our kitchen table. "If something happens to you, I want to make sure all your medical expenses are covered and that there's enough left over for me to take time off work to grieve properly." I'd been touched by his thoughtfulness, by how he was planning for scenarios he hoped would never happen. I'd signed the papers without reading them carefully, trusting that Marcus had my best interests at heart. Now I wondered what those policies actually said. What benefits would be paid out, and to whom? There had been other signs, red flags that I'd dismissed because they'd come from someone I trusted completely. Marcus had started asking detailed questions about my family's financial situation, particularly about inheritance laws and asset distribution. He'd framed these conversations as practical planning for our future together, explaining that as a physician, he'd seen too many families torn apart by poor financial planning during medical crises. "Your parents have built such an impressive legacy with their restaurant business," he'd said during dinner one evening. "Have they done proper estate planning? It would be terrible if something happened and their life's work got tied up in legal complications." My parents, Isabella and Roberto Rodriguez, had indeed built a successful chain of authentic Mexican restaurants throughout the state. They'd started with a single location 30 years ago and had gradually expanded into a small empire that employed over 200 people. Marcus had always shown interest in their business, asking thoughtful questions about operations and growth strategies. I'd attributed his curiosity to genuine care for my family, but now I remembered how his questions had become more specific over the past few months. He'd wanted to know about ownership structures, succession planning, And what would happen to the business if my parents weren't able to run it anymore? When I'd mentioned that I was listed as the primary beneficiary of their estate, his interest had become even more pronounced. "That's a huge responsibility, Elena," he'd said. "Have you thought about what you'd do with that kind of business empire? It's not something you could manage while dealing with your health issues." The conversation had made me uncomfortable at the time, though I hadn't been able to articulate why. Now I understood. Marcus had been calculating the value of my death, weighing the insurance benefits against the inheritance potential, determining the financial upside of becoming a widower rather than staying married to a cancer patient. As I sat in that desolate room, memories flooded back with new and terrible significance. The way Marcus had encouraged me to make a new will shortly after my diagnosis, suggesting that we should formalize our financial arrangements in case the cancer progressed more quickly than expected. The life insurance agent who'd come to our house for the policy update, how Marcus had answered most of the medical questions himself, how I'd been feeling too sick from chemotherapy to pay close attention to the details. "Elena just needs to sign here and here," Marcus had told the agent while I'd been curled up on the couch with a blanket, trying to manage the nausea from my latest treatment. "I can answer the medical questions since I'm familiar with her case." There had been phone calls that Marcus had taken in another room, conversations that would end abruptly when I entered the space. He'd explained them as consultations with colleagues about my treatment options, research discussions about experimental therapies. But now I wondered who he'd really been talking to, what arrangements he'd been making. The most chilling memory was from just 2 weeks ago. I'd woken up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom and had found Marcus in his study, working on his laptop with papers spread across his desk. When he'd noticed me, he'd quickly closed the laptop screen and gathered the documents. "Just reviewing some research about clinical trials," he'd said, but his voice had carried a tension I'd never heard before. "Go back to bed, Elena. You need your rest." I'd caught a glimpse of one of the papers before he'd collected them, and it had looked like some kind of medical certification or death certificate template. When I'd asked about it the next morning, Marcus had claimed I must have been confused, that the medications were affecting my perception and memory. "Elena, there were no death certificates on my desk," he'd said with a concerned expression. "That would be a very strange thing for me to have at home. I think the chemotherapy drugs might be causing some confusion." But I knew what I'd seen. The official letterhead, the medical terminology, the blank spaces waiting to be filled in with specific details. It had looked exactly like the death certificates I'd seen when my grandmother had passed away 5 years earlier. My hands shook as I remembered another conversation from last month. Marcus had been unusually interested in my daily routine at the treatment center, asking detailed questions about security procedures, visitor policies, and emergency protocols. "I just want to make sure you're safe there," he'd explained. "Some of these medical facilities have surprisingly lax security. As your husband and a physician, I need to know that you're in a protected environment." He'd asked about the layout of the treatment areas, the staffing levels during different shifts, the procedures for patients who experienced medical emergencies. At the time, his questions had seemed like the natural concern of a protective spouse. Now they felt like reconnaissance for some kind of plan. The abandoned hospital where I now found myself was starting to make horrible sense. If Marcus wanted to stage some kind of medical emergency or treatment complication, a facility like this would be perfect. No witnesses, no oversight, no real medical staff to ask inconvenient questions. Just enough legitimate-seeming medical equipment to make the scenario plausible. I thought about Nurse Patricia, the woman who'd greeted us yesterday. Something about her had felt off from the beginning. Her scrubs were clean but generic, without any identification badges or institutional logos. Her medical knowledge seemed superficial when I'd asked specific questions about treatment protocols. She'd deflected every inquiry with vague references to privacy policies and specialized procedures. "Every patient's treatment plan is completely individualized," she'd said when I'd asked about the facility's success rates. "We can't discuss specific outcomes due to confidentiality requirements." But real medical facilities loved to share their success statistics. Legitimate treatment centers proudly displayed their accreditation certificates, their physician credentials, their patient satisfaction scores. This place had none of those indicators of authentic medical practice. The absence of Dr. Richardson, the supposed head of this miraculous program, was another glaring red flag. What kind of specialized medical facility would admit a patient without an immediate consultation with the primary physician? Even if there had been an emergency, legitimate facilities had backup doctors, covering physicians, someone who could provide continuity of care. I remembered Marcus's reaction when I'd asked about meeting other patients or their families. He'd become defensive, explaining that privacy was paramount in experimental treatment programs, that patients preferred to maintain anonymity during their care. But every treatment center I'd ever visited had common areas where patients naturally encountered each other: support groups, family waiting rooms, buzzing with activity. The silence here was unnatural. No equipment alarms, no overhead pages, no conversations in the hallways. It felt less like a medical facility and more like a movie set, designed to look like a hospital from a distance. My phone had no signal in this remote location, which Marcus had attributed to the rural setting and the facility's specialized electromagnetic shielding to protect sensitive medical equipment. But now I wondered if the lack of communication access was intentional, designed to isolate patients from the outside world. As the morning progressed, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Nurse Patricia appeared in my doorway with a breakfast tray and a small cup containing what she described as my morning medications. "These are specially formulated for your particular treatment protocol," she explained, setting the tray on the small table. "Dr. Richardson designed them specifically based on your medical history." I stared at the pills, noting that they looked nothing like any cancer medications I'd taken before. They were unmarked capsules, no pharmaceutical identification, no dosage information. Legitimate prescription medications always had identifying marks, manufacturer codes, dosage specifications. "I'd like to speak with Dr. Richardson before taking any new medications," I said, pushing the cup away. "I need to understand how these interact with my current treatment regimen." Nurse Patricia's expression tightened slightly. "Dr. Richardson is still dealing with the emergency situation that came up yesterday. He'll see you as soon as possible. In the meantime, it's important that you maintain your medication schedule." "What kind of emergency?" I asked. "Is it something that affects my treatment plan?" "I'm not authorized to discuss other patient situations," she replied. "Patient confidentiality, you understand." But her evasiveness felt rehearsed, like she was following a script rather than explaining a genuine medical situation. Real healthcare providers were trained to address patient concerns with transparency and reassurance, not deflection and vague references to policies. After Nurse Patricia left, I examined the pills more closely. They had no markings whatsoever, which was highly unusual for prescription medications. I opened one of the capsules and found a white powder that had no particular odor or distinguishing characteristics. Without laboratory analysis, there was no way to know what these substances actually were. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of taking the medications, I flushed them down the toilet. If these were legitimate cancer treatments, missing one dose wouldn't significantly impact my recovery. But if they were something else entirely, something designed to incapacitate or harm me, avoiding them was crucial. The rest of the morning passed slowly, with no sign of Dr. Richardson or any other medical staff. Around noon, Nurse Patricia returned to check on me and collect the medication cup. When she saw it was empty, she seemed pleased. "Excellent," she said, making a note on her clipboard. "Dr. Richardson will be happy to hear that you're complying with the treatment protocol. He should be able to see you this afternoon." But afternoon came and went without any sign of the mysterious physician. When I asked Nurse Patricia about the delay, she explained that the emergency situation was more complex than originally anticipated, but that Dr. Richardson would definitely see me first thing the next morning. "In the meantime," she said, "he's prescribed some additional medications to help prepare your system for tomorrow's treatment session." She handed me another cup of unmarked pills. I accepted the medications but didn't take them, flushing them away as soon as she left. The pattern was becoming clear. They were trying to keep me sedated or incapacitated, probably to make whatever they had planned easier to accomplish. That evening, as I sat by my window watching the sun set over the empty fields surrounding the facility, I forced myself to confront the full scope of what I believed was happening. Marcus had orchestrated this entire situation to murder me in a way that would look like a medical complication. The abandoned hospital provided the perfect cover story. A cancer patient seeking experimental treatment at a private facility. Something going wrong with an innovative therapy. A tragic but explainable death. The insurance money would provide immediate financial relief, and my inheritance from my parents would secure his long-term future. As a widowed physician who'd lost his wife to cancer, despite his desperate attempts to save her, Marcus would gain not only financial benefits, but also sympathy and support from everyone who knew us. The brilliance of his plan was horrifying. Who would question the death of a cancer patient at a treatment facility? Who would investigate too deeply when the grieving husband was a respected physician who'd clearly done everything possible to save his wife? The remote location meant minimal oversight, and the experimental nature of the supposed treatment provided perfect cover for unexpected complications. But Marcus had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated me. The woman who'd blindly trusted him for 8 years was gone, replaced by someone who was fighting for her life. The fog of chemotherapy and the shock of diagnosis had lifted, revealing a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't going to be a passive victim in his scheme. I was going to survive this, and I was going to make sure he faced consequences for what he'd tried to do. But first, I needed to get out of this place before he returned, or before whoever was helping him decided it was time to implement the final phase of their plan. As darkness fell outside my window, I began planning my escape. I had no idea what resources were available to me, no way to contact the outside world, no clear understanding of where exactly I was or how far I'd have to travel to reach safety. But I had something that Marcus hadn't counted on. I had the absolute determination of a woman who discovered that the person she'd trusted most in the world was trying to kill her. The night stretched ahead of me, and I knew it might be my last chance to save my own life. Whatever happened next, I wasn't going to make it easy for them. Marcus had brought me here to die, but I was going to leave here very much alive. And when I did, I was going to expose him for exactly what he was. The old building settled around me with groans and creaks that had kept me awake through my second night in this nightmarish place. But the sleeplessness had been productive. I'd spent hours listening to the patterns of sound, learning the rhythm of this facility's operations, identifying when staff moved through the corridors, and when the building fell into complete silence. My escape began at 4 a.m, during what I'd determined was the longest quiet period. The hallways were dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting eerie shadows that made every corner potentially dangerous. But I moved carefully, my bare feet silent against the cold linoleum, staying close to the walls and pausing frequently to listen for any signs of activity. The exit I'd identified was a service door near the rear of the building, one that didn't appear to have an alarm system. During my careful observation from my window, I'd noticed that this door was used by staff members taking smoke breaks, and it never triggered any kind of security response when they opened it. Getting out of the building was only the first challenge. I was in the middle of rural farmland, miles from any town or major road, wearing only the thin hospital gown they'd given me and a pair of paper slippers. The October night air was bitter cold, and I knew I couldn't survive long exposed to the elements. But I'd noticed something during my window surveillance that gave me hope. About half a mile from the main building, there was what appeared to be an old farmhouse with a barn and several outbuildings. During the day, I'd seen lights and activity around the property, suggesting it was still occupied. If I could reach that farmhouse, I might find help or at least temporary shelter while I figured out my next steps. The walk across the open field was terrifying. Every shadow could have been someone pursuing me. Every sound could have been evidence that my escape had been discovered. The stubble from the harvested corn crop cut through my thin slippers, and the cold wind penetrated the hospital gown like it was made of paper. But I kept moving, focused on the distant lights that represented my only chance of survival. When I finally reached the farmhouse, I was shivering uncontrollably and could barely feel my feet. The property was clearly well maintained, with a neat yard and several vehicles parked near the main house. I approached the front door carefully, knowing that appearing on someone's doorstep at dawn in a hospital gown might understandably alarm them. The woman who answered my desperate knocking was probably in her 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes that immediately showed concern when she saw my condition. Her name was Dorothy Manning, and she would later tell me that in 40 years of living in this remote area, she'd never had anyone arrive at her door in such circumstances. "Oh my God, honey, what happened to you?" she said, immediately wrapping a heavy robe around my shoulders and pulling me inside. "Are you hurt? Do you need an ambulance?" The warmth of her kitchen was overwhelming after the cold night air, and it took me several minutes to stop shivering enough to speak coherently. Dorothy moved efficiently around her kitchen, starting coffee, wrapping me in additional blankets, and assessing my condition with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to handling emergencies. "Please," I managed to say through chattering teeth, "I need to call the police. I was being held at that old hospital building. My husband brought me there, but it's not a real treatment facility. I think he's trying to kill me." Dorothy's expression grew very serious as I explained my situation. She listened without interruption as I described Marcus's deception, the abandoned hospital, the suspicious medications, and my growing certainty that I'd been brought there to die. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd told her. "That old building has been empty for 15 years, she said finally. "Used to be Riverside County Hospital before they built the new medical center in town. Nobody's supposed to be operating any kind of medical facility there." Her confirmation of what I'd suspected sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. The building where Marcus had taken me wasn't just abandoned, it was completely unauthorized for medical use. Whatever was happening there was entirely fraudulent. Dorothy's husband, Frank, emerged from their bedroom as our conversation continued. He was a retired state trooper who listened to my story with the skeptical but thorough attention of someone trained in criminal investigation. His questions were pointed and professional, designed to assess the credibility of my account and the potential danger I might still be facing. "Ma'am, if what you're telling us is true, you're in serious danger," Frank said after I'd answered his questions. "But we need to be smart about how we handle this. If your husband is as calculating as you describe, involving local law enforcement too quickly might tip him off before we can build a solid case." Frank's law enforcement background proved invaluable in developing a plan that would protect me while gathering evidence of Marcus's crimes. He had contacts throughout the state police network, and he understood the legal requirements for building a case that would result in successful prosecution rather than just temporary protection. "The first thing we need to do is document everything," he explained while Dorothy continued providing me with warm clothes and hot food. "Your medical records, the insurance policies, any communication about this supposed treatment facility. We need to establish a clear timeline of deception." Dorothy contacted her daughter Sarah, who lived about an hour away and worked as a victim's advocate for the county prosecutor's office. Sarah drove out immediately and brought with her both legal expertise and resources for protective services. She also brought clothes, toiletries, and a secure phone that couldn't be traced to my usual contacts. "Elena, you've done something incredibly brave by escaping," Sarah told me as we sat around Dorothy's kitchen table later that morning. "But now we need to keep you safe while we investigate your husband's activities. He's going to realize you're missing soon, and we don't know how he'll react." The plan they developed was both simple and sophisticated. I would stay with Dorothy and Frank temporarily, while Sarah worked with law enforcement contacts to investigate the fraudulent hospital and Marcus's financial activities. Meanwhile, we would create the impression that I was still missing, allowing Marcus to believe his plan was still viable while we gathered evidence. Frank used his law enforcement connections to discreetly investigate the abandoned hospital. Within hours, he'd confirmed that no legitimate medical activity was authorized at that location. The building was owned by a holding company that had purchased it for eventual demolition, but there were no permits for any kind of medical operations. "Whoever your husband was working with, they were operating completely outside the law," Frank reported after making his calls. "The county health department has no record of any experimental treatment programs, and the state medical board shows no licensing for any physician named Richardson at that facility." Sarah's investigation into the insurance policies revealed the scope of Marcus's financial planning. She'd obtained legal authorization to review the policies and discovered that Marcus had increased my life insurance coverage to $2 million just 3 months after my cancer diagnosis. The applications contained medical information that suggested my prognosis was much worse than Dr. Williams had indicated. "Elena, according to these documents, Your husband told the insurance company that your cancer was terminal and that you had less than 6 months to live, Sarah explained as we reviewed the paperwork. But your actual medical records from Riverside Medical Center show a much more positive outlook. The falsified medical information was clearly insurance fraud, but it also provided insight into Marcus's timeline. He'd been planning this for months, carefully setting up the financial benefits while creating documentation that would support his narrative of a deteriorating cancer patient seeking desperate experimental treatment. Dr. Williams was cooperating fully with the investigation once Sarah's office contacted her. She provided comprehensive documentation of my actual medical condition and treatment progress, confirming that my prognosis was positive and that there was no medical justification for seeking alternative treatment. Your husband repeatedly asked about worst-case scenarios, Dr. Williams told Sarah during their phone conversation. He wanted detailed information about what would happen if the cancer metastasized, what the timeline would look like for various complications. At the time, I thought he was just being thorough, but looking back, his questions were quite specific. Meanwhile, Marcus was apparently conducting an increasingly frantic search for me. Frank's law enforcement contacts reported that he'd contacted multiple agencies claiming that I'd disappeared from the treatment facility and might be experiencing psychological complications from my cancer medications. He's telling everyone that you were confused and disoriented, that you might have wandered off and gotten lost, Frank explained after receiving updates from his contacts. He's playing the role of the concerned husband perfectly. But Marcus's performance was starting to show cracks. When investigators began asking detailed questions about the treatment facility where I'd supposedly disappeared, his answers were inconsistent. He couldn't provide contact information for Dr. Richardson, claimed the facility maintained extreme privacy policies, and became evasive when asked for specific addresses or licensing information. During my first week with Dorothy and Frank, I underwent a complete medical evaluation at a legitimate hospital 30 miles away. The tests confirmed that my cancer was responding well to treatment and that my overall health was much better than the insurance documents had suggested. More importantly, blood tests revealed traces of sedatives in my system, medications that weren't part of my prescribed treatment regimen. Elena, these test results show that you are being systematically drugged, the emergency room physician explained after reviewing my lab work. The medications in your system are powerful sedatives that would have made you confused and compliant. If you'd continued taking them, they could have been fatal, especially combined with your cancer treatments. The evidence was mounting, but Sarah warned me that we needed to be patient. Building a case that would result in serious criminal charges required thorough documentation and careful coordination with multiple agencies. Meanwhile, I was essentially in hiding, unable to contact my family or friends, living under an assumed identity, while investigators worked to expose Marcus's crimes. The isolation was difficult, but Dorothy and Frank provided more than just safety. They became surrogate family members who helped me process the trauma of discovering that my marriage had been built on deception, and that the person I'd trusted most had been planning my death. Elena, what you're going through is unimaginable, Dorothy said one evening as we sat on her porch watching the sunset. But you're stronger than you know. You trusted your instincts when it mattered most, and you saved your own life. Frank's law enforcement perspective helped me understand the broader implications of what Marcus had attempted. He explained that cases like mine were more common than people realized, but that they were difficult to prosecute because the victims often didn't survive to testify. The fact that you escaped and that we caught this before he could complete his plan makes this case very strong, Frank assured me. But we need to make sure we have ironclad evidence before we move forward with arrests. Sarah was working with federal investigators because the insurance fraud and the transport across state lines for criminal purposes made this a federal case. She also connected me with a victim's advocate who specialized in cases involving intimate partner violence and financial abuse. Elena, what your husband did goes beyond just attempted murder, the advocate explained during one of our sessions. This is a complex pattern of psychological manipulation, financial abuse, and calculated deception that probably started long before your cancer diagnosis. As the investigation progressed, I began to see our entire marriage in a new light. The romantic gestures that I'd treasured now seemed calculating. The way Marcus had encouraged me to rely on him for all major decisions suddenly looked like isolation tactics. His interest in my family's business and my inheritance potential had probably been present from the beginning. Predators like your husband are very skilled at identifying vulnerable targets and building relationships based on exploitation, the advocate explained. They often study their victims carefully, learning exactly how to present themselves as the perfect partner while planning for eventual financial gain. The phone calls from Marcus to various agencies were becoming more desperate as the investigation continued. He was reporting me missing to hospitals throughout the region, claiming that I might be suffering from chemotherapy-induced confusion or psychiatric complications from my diagnosis. He's creating a narrative that explains your disappearance while painting you as mentally unstable, Sarah explained. If his original plan had worked, these reports would have supported the story that you died due to complications from your confused mental state. But the evidence trail was leading investigators to very different conclusions. The financial records showed months of careful planning, the fraudulent medical documents revealed systematic deception, and the abandoned hospital provided clear evidence of a criminal conspiracy. Elena, we're ready to move forward with arrests, Sarah told me after 3 weeks of investigation. We have enough evidence to charge your husband with insurance fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy, but we need you to be prepared for what comes next. The prospect of facing Marcus in court was terrifying, but I was no longer the naive woman who'd trusted him blindly. The weeks with Dorothy and Frank had given me time to process what had happened and to prepare for the confrontation that would finally bring justice. I'm ready, I told Sarah, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I truly meant it. Marcus had brought me to that abandoned hospital to die, but instead he'd created the catalyst for my transformation into someone much stronger than he'd ever imagined. The safe house where I'd been staying for the past month was a modest apartment in a nondescript complex about 2 hours from my hometown. Sarah had arranged it through a federal victims protection program, and while it was a far cry from the comfortable home I'd shared with Marcus, it had given me the space and security I needed to prepare for what was coming next. My days were structured around building the strongest possible case against Marcus. I worked with investigators to document every detail of our marriage that might be relevant to establishing his pattern of deception and financial manipulation. Sarah had connected me with a forensic accountant who specialized in cases involving spousal financial abuse, and together we were uncovering a web of financial irregularities that went back years. The forensic accountant, Jennifer Walsh, had discovered that Marcus had been systematically redirecting funds from our joint accounts into investments and accounts I knew nothing about. The pattern had accelerated after my cancer diagnosis, suggesting that he'd been preparing for my death while simultaneously positioning himself to benefit financially from it. Elena, your husband has been essentially stealing from you for at least 2 years, Jennifer explained as we reviewed computer printouts spread across the kitchen table of my safe house. He's used your social security number and financial information to open accounts, make investments, and secure loans without your knowledge. The scope of the financial fraud was staggering. Marcus had used my credit and financial history to secure a business loan for what he'd claimed was a medical consulting venture. In reality, the money had been used to purchase luxury items and make high-risk investments that I'd never been told about. The business loan alone represents over $300,000 in debt that's legally your responsibility, Jennifer continued. If his plan had succeeded, he would have inherited your assets while your estate would have been responsible for debts you never authorized. My parents' restaurant business had also been targeted in ways I was only beginning to understand. Marcus had somehow obtained detailed financial information about their operations and had been using that information to secure credit in my name, claiming that I was planning to invest in restaurant expansion projects. He told creditors that you were the designated heir to a multi-million-dollar restaurant empire and that you were planning significant investments in new locations, Jennifer explained. Based on that false information, he was able to secure additional lines of credit and investment opportunities. The psychological evaluation that was part of my preparation for trial revealed the sophisticated nature of Marcus's manipulation tactics. Dr. Rebecca Harrison, a forensic psychologist who specialized in cases involving intimate partner abuse, helped me understand how I'd been systematically isolated and controlled without realizing it. Elena, your husband used a combination of techniques that are common among sophisticated predators, Dr. Harrison explained during one of our sessions. He isolated you from independent financial advice, controlled your access to medical information, and gradually undermined your confidence in your own judgment. The process of recognizing the manipulation was both painful and liberating. I began to see how Marcus had subtly discouraged me from maintaining close friendships, how he'd positioned himself as the sole source of reliable information about my medical condition, and how he'd gradually taken control of all major financial decisions in our marriage. The cancer diagnosis provided him with the perfect opportunity to accelerate his control, Dr. Harrison continued. Patients facing serious illness are naturally vulnerable and dependent on their support systems. He exploited that vulnerability systematically. Meanwhile, the investigation into the abandoned hospital had revealed a conspiracy that extended beyond just Marcus. The facility had been used for at least 3 other suspicious incidents over the past 2 years, suggesting that this was part of a larger criminal enterprise involving fake medical facilities and fraudulent treatments. Federal agents had identified Dr. James Richardson as a real person, but one who'd had his medical license revoked 5 years earlier for insurance fraud and patient endangerment. He'd apparently been operating under various false identities, providing fake medical services to people who were being targeted for financial exploitation. Richardson specializes in creating elaborate medical deceptions, Agent Michael Torres explained during one of our preparation sessions. He works with people like your husband to create scenarios where the victim's death appears to be the result of legitimate medical complications. Nurse Patricia had been identified as Richardson's longtime associate, Linda Chen, who had nursing training but no current license to practice. Together, they'd created multiple fake medical facilities that were used to stage medical emergencies or treatment complications that resulted in the victim's death. Elena, you're probably the first intended victim who escaped before the final phase of their plan, Agent Torres continued. Your testimony will be crucial in exposing this entire operation and preventing future victims. The preparation for trial was intensive and emotionally exhausting. I had to review hundreds of documents, provide detailed testimony about every aspect of my relationship with Marcus, and prepare for the aggressive cross-examination that his defense team would undoubtedly conduct. Sarah had connected me with Amanda Foster, a prosecutor who specialized in complex financial crimes involving intimate partner violence. Amanda was both brilliant and compassionate, understanding that my case represented more than just financial fraud or attempted murder. Elena, this case is about the systematic exploitation of trust in its most intimate form, Amanda explained as we prepared my testimony. Your husband didn't just steal money or attempt murder. He weaponized your love and trust against you in the most calculating way possible. The defense strategy was already becoming clear through pretrial motions and discovery requests. Marcus's attorneys were planning to argue that I'd suffered psychological complications from my cancer treatment that had caused me to misinterpret innocent actions and create elaborate conspiracy theories. They're going to claim that chemotherapy drugs affected your mental state and that you became paranoid and delusional, Amanda warned me. We need to be prepared to counter that narrative with clear evidence and expert testimony. Dr. Williams had been invaluable in preparing medical testimony that would counter any claims about my mental state. She'd provided comprehensive documentation showing that my cognitive function had remained normal throughout my treatment, and that the medications I'd been prescribed had no history of causing the kind of psychological complications the defense was likely to claim. Elena's medical records show no evidence of cognitive impairment or psychological complications from her cancer treatment, Dr. Williams had stated in her deposition. Her questions and concerns throughout her treatment were entirely rational and appropriate for someone facing her diagnosis. The most challenging aspect of preparation was learning to control my emotional responses during testimony. The defense would undoubtedly try to provoke me into appearing unstable or overly emotional, hoping to support their narrative that I was psychologically compromised. Elena, your strength and clarity will be your best defense against their tactics, Amanda advised during our practice sessions. Stay focused on the facts, answer only the questions being asked, and don't let them draw you into emotional responses. Frank Manning had become an unofficial advisor during my preparation, helping me understand courtroom procedures and what to expect during cross-examination. His law enforcement background gave him insight into how defense attorneys would try to undermine my testimony. Elena, they're going to try to make you doubt your own perceptions and memories, Frank warned during one of his visits to my safe house. Stay grounded in what you know to be true, and don't let them confuse you with hypothetical scenarios or alternative interpretations. The financial evidence was so overwhelming that Amanda was confident we could secure convictions on the fraud charges, even if the attempted murder charges proved more difficult to establish beyond reasonable doubt. The insurance fraud alone carried potential sentences that would keep Marcus in prison for decades. Elena, the financial evidence speaks for itself, Amanda assured me. The forged documents, the unauthorized accounts, the false statements to insurance companies. These are facts that can't be explained away by claims about your mental state. As the trial date approached, I found myself experiencing a complex mix of emotions. There was fear about facing Marcus in court and having our private life dissected in public proceedings. There was anger about the years of deception and the calculated way he'd planned my death. But there was also a growing sense of strength and purpose. Elena, you've already won the most important victory, Dr. Harrison told me during one of our final preparation sessions. You trusted your instincts when it mattered most, you saved your own life, and you're ensuring that he can't do this to anyone else. Marcus had done to me a declaration of my determination to rebuild my life on my own terms. Writing it had been cathartic, helping me process the full scope of the betrayal while also recognizing my own resilience and growth. The media attention surrounding the case was intense, but carefully managed by the prosecutor's office. The story of a respected physician attempting to murder his cancer patient wife for insurance money had captured national attention, but Amanda had worked to protect my privacy while ensuring that the public understood the seriousness of the crimes. Elena, your case is highlighting issues that affect thousands of people, Amanda explained as we reviewed media coverage. Intimate partner financial abuse is far more common than most people realize, and your courage in coming forward is encouraging other victims to seek help. 3 days before the trial was scheduled to begin, Marcus's defense team made a surprising move. They requested a meeting with the prosecution to discuss a potential plea agreement. Marcus was apparently beginning to understand that the evidence against him was overwhelming, and that a jury trial would likely result in maximum sentences. Elena, they're offering to plead guilty to the financial fraud charges in exchange for dropping the attempted murder charges, Amanda explained during an emergency meeting at the courthouse. He would still face significant prison time, but it would be substantially less than if he's convicted on all charges. The decision about whether to accept a plea agreement was ultimately mine to make, though Amanda strongly advised against it. The attempted murder charges were the most serious crimes Marcus had committed, and accepting a plea that eliminated them would send the wrong message about the severity of his actions. Elena, if we accept this plea, he could be out of prison in as little as 7 years, Amanda warned. Given the sophistication of his planning and the fact that he would have succeeded if you hadn't escaped, I believe he deserves the maximum punishment available under the law. I thought about Dorothy and Frank Manning, who had risked their own safety to help me when I'd appeared at their door in the middle of the night. I thought about Dr. Williams, who had provided excellent medical care that Marcus had systematically undermined. I thought about my parents, who still didn't fully understand how close they'd come to losing their daughter to a man they'd welcomed into our family. No plea agreement, I told Amanda firmly. He needs to face the full consequences of what he tried to do. And other potential victims need to see that this kind of crime will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Amanda smiled with satisfaction. I was hoping you'd say that, Elena. This case deserves to go to trial, and I'm confident that a jury will see Marcus for exactly what he is. The final weekend before the trial began, I stayed with Dorothy and Frank at their farmhouse. It felt appropriate to return to the place where my recovery had begun, where I'd first started to understand my own strength and resilience. Elena, you've come so far from the terrified woman who knocked on our door that night, Dorothy observed as we sat on her porch watching the sunset. You've transformed something horrible into an opportunity to protect other people and hold a dangerous man accountable. Frank had been following the case closely through his law enforcement contacts, and he was confident that the prosecution had built an unshakable case. Elena, the evidence is overwhelming, he assured me. The financial records, the fake medical facility, the fraudulent insurance documents. Marcus is going down, and he's going down hard. That night, I wrote in the journal that Dr. Harrison had encouraged me to keep throughout my recovery process. Looking back at my entries from the early days after my escape, I could see how much I'd changed. The confused and terrified woman who'd fled from that abandoned hospital had been replaced by someone much stronger and more determined. I used to think that trust was about giving someone complete control over your life, I wrote. Now I understand that real trust requires maintaining your own independence and judgment. Marcus exploited my willingness to surrender my autonomy, but that will never happen again. The courthouse steps were crowded with media and spectators on the morning Marcus's trial began. I walked through the crowd, flanked by Amanda and Agent Torres. Wearing a simple navy blue suit that projected competence and credibility without seeming flashy or attention-seeking. My parents had flown in from Phoenix to support me, and seeing their faces in the crowd gave me strength I hadn't realized I needed. Inside the courtroom, I got my first look at Marcus in over 2 months. He was thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes and a defeated posture that was very different from the confident physician I'd been married to. When our eyes met briefly, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no residual love. Just a cold recognition that this man had tried to kill me for money. Amanda's opening statement was methodical and devastating. She walked the jury through the timeline of Marcus's deception, from the initial insurance fraud through the elaborate scheme involving the abandoned hospital. She presented the case as a story of calculated betrayal that had only been prevented by my courage and the help of people who'd believed my account when I'd escaped. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about the systematic exploitation of trust in its most intimate form, Amanda began. Elena Rodriguez trusted her husband to protect her when she was most vulnerable. Instead, Marcus Chen saw her cancer diagnosis as an opportunity for financial gain and began planning her death. The defense attorney, David Walsh, tried to present Marcus as a devoted husband whose judgment had been clouded by grief and desperation over his wife's diagnosis. He suggested that my interpretation of events had been influenced by the psychological effects of cancer treatment, and that what I'd perceived as a murder plot was actually a series of misunderstandings and coincidences. My client is a respected physician who dedicated his career to saving lives, Walsh argued in his opening statement. The prosecution wants you to believe that this man suddenly became a calculating killer, but the evidence will show that Mrs. Chen's perceptions were distorted by the trauma of her diagnosis and the effects of her medical treatment. The prosecution's case unfolded over 5 days of testimony that methodically destroyed any possibility that Marcus's actions could be explained as innocent misunderstandings. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic accountant, presented evidence of financial fraud that went back years and had accelerated dramatically after my cancer diagnosis. The defendant systematically diverted funds from joint accounts, opened credit lines using his wife's identity, and made financial commitments that would have left Mrs. Chen's estate responsible for hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, Jennifer testified. This pattern of financial abuse created powerful motives for wanting Mrs. Chen to die rather than recover from her illness. Dr. Williams testified about Marcus's unusual behavior during my treatment, particularly his persistent questions about worst-case scenarios and his resistance to positive news about my prognosis. Her testimony was particularly damaging to the defense narrative that Marcus had been a devoted husband trying to save his wife. The defendant repeatedly asked about terminal complications and end-stage scenarios that weren't relevant to Mrs. Chen's actual medical condition, Dr. Williams explained to the jury. His questions were more consistent with someone planning for a patient's death than someone hoping for their recovery. Agent Torres presented evidence about the abandoned hospital and the criminal conspiracy involving Dr. Richardson and Nurse Patricia. The fake medical facility had been used in at least 3 other suspicious deaths over the past 2 years, establishing a pattern of criminal activity that contradicted any claims about innocent intentions. The defendant transported his wife to a facility that had no legal authority to provide medical treatment, where she was given unidentified medications by unlicensed personnel, Agent Torres testified. This was not a misguided attempt to find alternative treatment. This was a carefully planned scheme to cause Mrs. Chen's death in a way that would appear to be a medical complication. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Richardson himself testified as part of a plea agreement he'd negotiated with federal prosecutors. His testimony confirmed that Marcus had contacted him specifically to arrange for my death to appear to be the result of treatment complications. The defendant explained that his wife had cancer and substantial life insurance coverage. Richardson testified in a flat, emotionless voice. He wanted her death to appear to be the result of an adverse reaction to experimental treatment, so that no one would question the insurance claim. Richardson's testimony included details about the medications I'd been given, which were powerful sedatives designed to incapacitate me while creating symptoms that would justify a medical emergency. If I'd continued taking them, they would have caused respiratory depression that could have been fatal, particularly in combination with my legitimate cancer medications. The plan was for Mrs. Chen to appear to suffer complications from the experimental treatment, Richardson continued. Her death would have been attributed to an unfortunate reaction to innovative therapy, with her husband appearing to be a devoted spouse who had tried everything to save her. When it came time for my testimony, I felt surprisingly calm and focused. Amanda had prepared me thoroughly, and I understood that my role was simply to tell the truth about what had happened and let the jury draw their own conclusions. I testified about the gradual changes in Marcus's behavior after my diagnosis, his persistent efforts to undermine my confidence in conventional treatment, and his insistence on finding alternative options that seemed too good to be true. I described the abandoned hospital, the suspicious medications, and the pre-signed discharge papers that had first alerted me to the true nature of the situation. When I saw those discharge papers with tomorrow's date already filled in, I realized that Marcus hadn't brought me there for treatment. I testified. He'd brought me there to die. The defense cross-examination was aggressive, but ultimately ineffective. Walsh tried to suggest that my perceptions had been distorted by medication and psychological trauma, but my testimony remained consistent and was supported by overwhelming physical evidence. Mrs. Chen, isn't it possible that you misinterpreted your husband's actions because you were frightened and confused by your diagnosis? Walsh asked during cross-examination. No, I replied calmly. I was certainly frightened by having cancer, but my thinking was clear. The evidence speaks for itself. The insurance fraud, the fake medical facility, the unauthorized medications. These aren't misinterpretations. These are documented facts. My parents testified about Marcus's suspicious interest in our family's financial situation and his persistent questions about inheritance planning. Their testimony helped establish that his interest in my potential death extended beyond just insurance benefits to include my substantial inheritance from their restaurant business. Marcus asked very specific questions about our estate planning and what would happen to our business assets if something happened to Elena. My father testified. At the time, we thought he was being responsible about financial planning. Now we understand he was calculating the value of our daughter's death. The prosecution's final witness was Dr. Harrison, the forensic psychologist who had evaluated me during my preparation for trial. Her testimony effectively countered the defense claims about my mental state and provided expert analysis of Marcus's behavior patterns. Mrs. Chen shows no evidence of psychological impairment or delusional thinking, Dr. Harrison testified. Her account of events is consistent, logical, and supported by physical evidence. In contrast, the defendant's behavior shows classic patterns of intimate partner abuse and financial exploitation. The defense case was brief and largely ineffective. Walsh called character witnesses who testified about Marcus's reputation as a physician and his apparent devotion to me during our marriage. But their testimony was undermined by the overwhelming evidence of his criminal planning. Marcus himself did not testify, probably because his attorneys understood that cross-examination would have been devastating. There was simply no way to explain away the insurance fraud, the fake medical facility, and the systematic financial abuse that had been documented so thoroughly. Amanda's closing argument was passionate and compelling, tying together all the evidence into a coherent narrative of betrayal and attempted murder. She reminded the jury that my escape had been the only thing preventing Marcus from succeeding in his plan, and that his crimes deserved the harshest punishment available under the law. Elena Rodriguez trusted her husband with her life, and he tried to use that trust to kill her, Amanda concluded. She survived only because of her own courage and the kindness of strangers who believed her when she asked for help. Marcus Chen is not a devoted husband who made mistakes. He is a calculating predator who saw his wife's illness as an opportunity for profit. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Marcus was convicted of attempted murder, insurance fraud, conspiracy, financial abuse, and multiple counts of identity theft. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month, with prosecutors recommending the maximum sentence of 45 years in prison. When the verdicts were read, I felt a profound sense of relief and vindication. The justice system had worked exactly as it was supposed to, protecting an innocent victim and holding a dangerous criminal accountable for his crimes. Marcus showed no emotion as the verdicts were announced, staring straight ahead as if he'd already mentally disconnected from the proceedings. Outside the courthouse, I was surrounded by reporters asking about my reaction to the verdicts and my plans for the future. With Amanda's guidance, I gave a brief statement that focused on the broader implications of the case, rather than my personal feelings about Marcus. Today's verdicts send a clear message that intimate partner abuse and financial exploitation will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, I said to the assembled media. I hope that other victims will see this case and understand that they have options, that they can get help, and that they can hold their abusers accountable. The sentencing hearing a month later was anticlimactic. Marcus's attorneys made perfunctory arguments for leniency, but the judge was clearly unimpressed by their appeals. She sentenced him to the maximum 45 years in prison, ensuring that he would be in his 80s before becoming eligible for parole. Mr. Chen, you violated the most fundamental trust that exists between human beings, Judge Patricia Morrison said, before imposing sentence. You exploited your wife's illness and vulnerability for financial gain, and you would have succeeded in killing her if not for her own courage and the help of good people who believed her story. As I left the courthouse after sentencing, I felt like I was finally closing the door on the most traumatic chapter of my life. Marcus would spend the rest of his productive years in prison. Other potential victims had been protected from Richardson's criminal network, and I was free to rebuild my life according to my own values and priorities. The civil litigation that followed the criminal trial resulted in the recovery of most of the money Marcus had stolen, plus significant damages from the insurance companies that had been defrauded. The financial settlement provided me with resources to start over completely, without any dependence on assets that had been tainted by his crimes. 6 months after the trial ended, I was living in a small coastal town in Northern California, working as a freelance graphic designer while exploring my interest in fine art photography. The cancer treatment that Dr. Williams had prescribed was working exactly as she'd predicted, and my latest scans showed no evidence of disease progression. The house I'd rented overlooked the Pacific Ocean, and I spent my mornings walking on the beach while planning my day's work. The contrast with my previous life was dramatic, but every aspect of my new independence felt like a gift I'd earned through surviving the worst betrayal imaginable. Dorothy and Frank Manning visited me regularly, and we'd developed a family-like bond that was based on genuine affection rather than legal obligations or social expectations. They'd literally saved my life by believing my story and helping me when I was most vulnerable, and their friendship had become one of the most valuable relationships in my life. Elena, you've built something beautiful here, Dorothy observed during one of their visits as we sat on my deck watching the sunset. You took something horrible and transformed it into a new beginning that's entirely your own. My relationship with my parents had also been strengthened by the ordeal. They'd been devastated to learn how close they'd come to losing me, and they'd gained a new appreciation for my strength and independence. The family business was thriving under their continued leadership, and they'd updated their estate planning to include additional protections against the kind of exploitation Marcus had attempted. The victim advocacy work I'd begun during my recovery had evolved into a more formal role as a consultant for prosecutors handling intimate partner violence cases. My experience provided valuable insights into the psychology of financial abuse and the challenges victims faced when trying to escape sophisticated predators. Elena, your case has become a model for how to investigate and prosecute these complex crimes, Sarah told me during one of our regular conversations. Prosecutors around the country are using your case file as a training tool for handling similar situations. The book I was writing about my experience was nearing completion, and my literary agent was confident that it would find a publisher who could help me reach other potential victims. The working title was Prescribed Betrayal: How I Escaped My Husband's Plan to Kill Me, and it combined my personal story with practical advice for recognizing and escaping financial abuse. Elena, your story has the power to save lives, my agent explained during our latest meeting. There are thousands of people in situations similar to what you experienced, and they need to know that escape is possible and that justice can be achieved. 1 year after Marcus's sentencing, I received word that Richardson had died in federal prison, apparently from natural causes related to his advanced age and poor health. His death closed the final chapter on the criminal network that had nearly cost me my life, ensuring that no other victims would suffer from their elaborate schemes. The anniversary of my escape from the abandoned hospital had become a personal holiday that I observed with quiet reflection and gratitude. Each year, I returned to visit Dorothy and Frank, bringing flowers to place at the spot where I'd first knocked on their door asking for help. Elena, you've turned the worst thing that ever happened to you into something that's helping other people, Frank observed during our anniversary visit. That takes a special kind of strength and character. The photography exhibition I was preparing for a local gallery included images that captured the beauty and resilience I'd found in my new life. The centerpiece was a series of sunrise photographs taken from my beach house, representing the daily renewal and hope that had become central to my recovery. My health continued to improve steadily, with regular checkups showing that the cancer remained in complete remission. Dr. Williams had remained involved in my care through referrals to specialists in my new location, and she continued to be amazed by my physical and emotional recovery. Elena, you're one of the strongest people I've ever treated, Dr. Williams told me during one of our phone consultations. You faced down both cancer and a calculating murderer, and you've emerged from both challenges healthier and stronger than ever. The romantic relationship I'd begun with David, a fellow artist I'd met through the local photography community, was developing slowly and carefully. After Marcus's betrayal, I was naturally cautious about trusting anyone with intimate access to my life, but David's patience and consistency were gradually earning my confidence. Elena, I understand why you need to take things slowly, David told me during one of our evening walks on the beach. What you survived would make anyone careful about trust. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm happy to earn your confidence at whatever pace feels right to you. The second anniversary of my escape approached with a profound sense of completion and new beginning. I'd not only survived Marcus's attempt to kill me, but I'd transformed the experience into something that was helping other people and building a life that was more authentic and fulfilling than anything I'd experienced during my marriage. The final chapter of my book concluded with reflections on the nature of trust, resilience, and recovery. I'd learned that survival was only the first step in healing from profound betrayal, and that true recovery required building a life based on your own values, rather than trying to return to what had existed before the trauma. Marcus brought me to that abandoned hospital to die, but instead he gave me the opportunity to discover who I really am when everything else is stripped away. I wrote in the book's conclusion, he wanted to destroy me for money, but he accidentally set me free to become someone stronger and more authentic than I'd ever been while living under his control. The woman who'd trusted blindly and nearly died for it was gone forever, replaced by someone who trusted wisely and lived fully. Marcus's plan had failed completely. Not just because I'd escaped, but because the life I'd built afterward was infinitely better than anything he could have destroyed. Part 4. The Preparation. The federal building in downtown Sacramento felt imposing as I walked through the security checkpoint for what would be the most important meeting of my life. 3 months had passed since my escape from the abandoned hospital, and the investigation had reached the point where federal prosecutors were ready to present their case to a grand jury. Today would be my final preparation session before facing the legal system that would determine whether Marcus Chen would pay for his crimes. Assistant United States Attorney Rebecca Martinez greeted me in a conference room lined with evidence boxes and witness statements. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately inspired confidence. This was someone who understood the gravity of what Marcus had attempted and was determined to see justice served. Elena, I want you to understand the scope of what we're dealing with, Rebecca began, spreading photographs and documents across the conference table. Your husband's conspiracy extends far beyond just attempting to murder you for insurance money. We've uncovered a network of fraudulent medical facilities operating throughout the western United States, all designed to facilitate what are essentially contract killings disguised as medical complications. The photographs showed buildings similar to the abandoned hospital where Marcus had taken me. Decrepit structures in remote locations, all formerly legitimate medical facilities that had been repurposed for criminal activity. Each location had been used multiple times over the past 5 years, suggesting a sophisticated operation that had been claiming victims long before I became a target. Dr. James Richardson, the man who would have overseen your murder, has been running this network since losing his medical license in Nevada 6 years ago, Rebecca continued. We've identified at least 12 suspicious deaths at facilities like the one where your husband took you. In each case, the victim was brought there by a spouse or family member who stood to benefit financially from their death. The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering. Richardson had been recruiting doctors, nurses, and other medical professionals who'd lost their licenses or were facing disciplinary action, offering them substantial payments to participate in elaborate murder schemes. The abandoned hospitals provided perfect cover because they looked legitimate enough to fool victims initially, but were isolated enough to prevent outside interference. Elena, your escape and testimony will be crucial in shutting down this entire operation, Rebecca explained. You're the first intended victim who survived to tell the story, and your account provides the inside perspective we need to prosecute not just your husband, but the entire criminal network. The financial investigation had revealed the full extent of Marcus's planning and the sophisticated way he'd positioned himself to benefit from my death. Special Agent Maria Santos from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had spent weeks analyzing bank records, insurance policies, and investment accounts that painted a picture of calculated greed spanning several years. Mrs. Rodriguez, your husband began preparing for your death almost immediately after your cancer diagnosis, Agent Santos explained as she walked me through computer printouts and financial documents. Within 2 weeks of your first oncology appointment, he increased your life insurance coverage to $3 million and began making inquiries about expedited claim processing in cases of terminal illness. The timeline was chilling in its precision. While I'd been processing the emotional trauma of a cancer diagnosis and beginning treatment, Marcus had been researching insurance policies, calculating potential payouts, and apparently shopping for criminal services to ensure my death would appear natural and inevitable. The offshore accounts that investigators had discovered contained not just money that Marcus had stolen from our joint finances, but payments he'd received from other participants in Richardson's network. He hadn't just been a client seeking services to murder his wife. He'd been recruited as an active participant in other people's schemes. Elena, your husband received over $200,000 in the past 18 months for his role in facilitating other suspicious deaths, Agent Santos continued. As a respected cardiac surgeon, he provided medical credibility to scenarios that might otherwise have seemed questionable to insurance investigators. This revelation was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the entire case. Marcus hadn't just been planning my murder, he'd been helping other people kill their spouses, family members, and business partners, while perfecting the techniques he would eventually use against me. Every time he'd come home from what I'd believed were medical conferences or consulting jobs, he might have been participating in someone else's death. The preparation sessions with Rebecca and her team were intensive and emotionally exhausting. I had to review every detail of my relationship with Marcus, looking for patterns and evidence that could be used to establish his criminal intent and the premeditated nature of his actions. Elena, we need you to help us understand the psychological manipulation that made this possible, Rebecca explained during one of our sessions. Juries need to see not just that your husband tried to kill you, but how he systematically undermined your ability to recognize the danger you were in. Dr. Patricia Williams from Riverside Medical Center had become a key witness in building the case against Marcus. Her detailed notes from my treatment showed a pattern of interference and manipulation that had been designed to isolate me from legitimate medical care while creating opportunities for the criminal network to intervene. Dr. Chen repeatedly questioned my treatment decisions and suggested that conventional approaches were inadequate for his wife's condition, Dr. Williams testified during her deposition. He insisted that experimental therapies would be more effective, despite the fact that Mrs. Rodriguez was responding well to standard treatment protocols. The psychological evaluation that was part of my preparation revealed the sophisticated nature of the manipulation I'd experienced. Dr. Linda Morrison, a forensic psychologist specializing in cases involving intimate partner violence, helped me understand how Marcus had systematically eroded my confidence and independence, while positioning himself as my sole source of reliable information. Elena, your husband used techniques that are common among sophisticated predators, Dr. Morrison explained during one of our sessions. He isolated you from independent sources of medical information, controlled your access to financial resources, and gradually undermined your confidence in your own judgment. The process of recognizing the manipulation was both painful and liberating. I began to see how Marcus had subtly discouraged me from seeking second opinions about my treatment, how he'd positioned himself as the medical expert in our relationship, and how he'd gradually taken control of all communication with insurance companies and financial institutions. The cancer diagnosis provided him with the perfect opportunity to accelerate his control, Dr. Morrison continued. Patients facing serious illness are naturally vulnerable and dependent on their support systems. He exploited that vulnerability systematically while planning your death. My parents had flown in from Phoenix to participate in witness preparation sessions. Isabella and Roberto Rodriguez were still struggling to understand how they'd been deceived by someone they'd welcomed into our family and trusted with their daughter's well-being. We thought Marcus was devoted to Elena, my mother said during her interview with prosecutors. He seemed so concerned about her health, so determined to find the best possible treatment. We never imagined he was planning to kill her. The financial documents related to my parents' restaurant business revealed another layer of Marcus's criminal planning. He'd been systematically gathering information about their assets and business operations, apparently calculating the inheritance value that would come to me upon their deaths, and eventually to him as my widowed spouse. Mr. Chen asked very detailed questions about our succession planning and estate structure, my father testified. We thought he was being responsible about financial planning for Elena's future. Now we understand he was calculating the total value of eliminating our entire family. The revelation that Marcus had been researching my parents' mortality and the potential for accelerating their deaths was almost too horrible to process. The criminal network he'd joined wasn't just focused on individual murders. They were capable of eliminating entire families when the financial incentives were large enough. Rebecca's team had identified other families who'd been targeted by the network, and the patterns were remarkably consistent. In each case, a family member with medical knowledge or financial expertise would identify potential victims with substantial life insurance or inheritance value, then work with Richardson's network to stage medical emergencies or treatment complications that would result in their deaths. Elena, your case is helping us understand how these criminals select and research their targets, Rebecca explained. The fact that your husband is a physician gave him access to medical records and insurance information that allowed him to identify the most profitable scenarios. The abandoned hospital where Marcus had taken me was being thoroughly investigated by federal agents and forensic specialists. What they discovered painted a picture of a facility designed specifically for committing undetectable murders, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate medical care. The building had been modified to look like a functioning medical facility from the inside, but all the equipment was either non-functional or deliberately calibrated to cause harm rather than provide treatment, Agent Torres explained during one of our preparation sessions. The medications that were available were primarily powerful sedatives and drugs that could cause cardiac arrest or respiratory failure. The forensic analysis of the pills I'd been given revealed that they contained a combination of substances that would have been fatal if I'd continued taking them as prescribed. The dosages were calculated to cause a gradual decline in vital functions that would have appeared to be complications from cancer treatment rather than deliberate poisoning. Elena, if you had taken those medications for even 3 more days, you would have experienced multiple organ failure that would have been extremely difficult to reverse, the forensic toxicologist explained. Your decision to stop taking them probably saved your life. The preparation for my testimony was particularly challenging because I had to maintain emotional control while describing experiences that had been terrifying and traumatic. Rebecca worked with me extensively on techniques for staying focused and credible, while recounting the most difficult aspects of my experience. Elena, the defense is going to try to portray you as confused or emotionally unstable, Rebecca warned during one of our practice sessions. They'll suggest that the stress of your cancer diagnosis caused you to misinterpret innocent actions and create conspiracy theories. You need to stay calm and stick to the facts, letting the evidence speak for itself. The evidence was indeed overwhelming. Financial records, insurance documents, medical records, forensic analysis of the medications, testimony from other victims' families, and documentation of the criminal network's operations created a comprehensive picture of guilt that would be difficult for any defense team to counter. Marcus's defense attorneys had been making increasingly desperate motions to suppress evidence and delay the trial. They tried to argue that the investigation had violated his constitutional rights, that evidence had been obtained illegally, and that I was an unreliable witness due to psychological trauma. Each motion had been rejected by the federal judge overseeing the case. Elena, his lawyers know they have an unwinnable case, Rebecca explained after the latest defense motion had been denied. They're stalling and hoping for some kind of procedural error that might create grounds for appeal, but the evidence against your husband is ironclad. The grand jury had returned indictments on multiple federal charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. The racketeering charges were particularly significant because they allowed prosecutors to seek enhanced penalties and to target the entire criminal network rather than just individual participants. Elena, the RICO charges mean that if your husband is convicted, he's looking at life in prison without the possibility of parole, Rebecca explained. The federal sentencing guidelines for racketeering involving murder are extremely severe, especially when the defendant played an active role in multiple deaths. The preparation also involved coordinating with state prosecutors in Nevada, Arizona, and Oregon, who were preparing cases against other members of Richardson's network. My testimony would be crucial in multiple jurisdictions, helping to establish the scope and operation of the criminal enterprise. Elena, your case has become the cornerstone for prosecuting this entire organization, Rebecca explained. You're the key witness who can explain how the network operated from the victim's perspective, and your survival provides the credibility we need to secure convictions in all the related cases. The media attention surrounding the case was intense but carefully managed by the prosecutor's office. The story of a respected physician attempting to murder his cancer patient wife had captured national attention, but Rebecca had worked to protect my privacy while ensuring that the public understood the broader implications of the criminal network. Elena, your case is highlighting issues that affect thousands of people, Rebecca explained as we reviewed media coverage. Medical fraud and intimate partner violence are both serious problems, and your courage in coming forward is encouraging other victims to seek help in law enforcement agencies to investigate similar schemes. The victim impact statement I was preparing was both a summary of the harm Marcus had caused and a declaration of my determination to help other potential victims. Writing it had been cathartic, helping me process the full scope of the betrayal while also recognizing my own resilience and growth. Your Honor, the defendant didn't just try to kill me for money, I wrote in my statement. He exploited my trust, my illness, and my love to facilitate what would have been the perfect murder. He turned my cancer diagnosis into a weapon against me, and he would have succeeded if I hadn't trusted my instincts when everything seemed wrong. The statement also addressed the broader implications of the case and the need for systemic changes to prevent similar crimes. Insurance companies needed better fraud detection systems, medical facilities needed more rigorous oversight, and law enforcement agencies needed training to recognize the signs of sophisticated murder conspiracies. The criminal network that my husband joined represents a new kind of organized crime that exploits weaknesses in our healthcare and insurance systems, I continued in my statement. These criminals are sophisticated, well-connected, and extremely dangerous. The only way to stop them is through aggressive prosecution and systemic reforms that make their schemes impossible to execute. 3 days before the trial was scheduled to begin, Marcus's defense team made a final attempt to negotiate a plea agreement. They offered to have him plead guilty to the financial fraud charges, in exchange for dropping the attempted murder and racketeering charges. The proposed sentence would have allowed him to be eligible for parole in 15 years. Elena, they're getting desperate, Rebecca explained during an emergency meeting to discuss the plea offer. They know that if this case goes to trial, Marcus is facing life in prison. They're hoping you'll accept a compromise that guarantees some punishment while avoiding the possibility of a death sentence. The decision about whether to accept a plea agreement was ultimately mine to make, though Rebecca strongly advised against it. The attempted murder and racketeering charges were the most serious crimes Marcus had committed, and accepting a plea that eliminated them would send the wrong message about the severity of his actions. Elena, if we accept this plea, he could be out of prison while he's still young enough to harm other people, Rebecca warned. Given the sophistication of his planning, and the fact that he participated in multiple murders, I believe he deserves the maximum punishment available under federal law. I thought about all the other victims who hadn't been as fortunate as I'd been. Families who'd lost loved ones to this criminal network, people who'd died trusting the wrong person, victims who'd never had the chance to tell their stories or see justice served. No plea agreement, I told Rebecca firmly. He needs to face the full consequences of what he did, and other potential victims need to see that this kind of crime will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Rebecca smiled with satisfaction. I was hoping you'd say that, Elena. This case deserves to go to trial, and I'm confident that a jury will see Marcus for exactly what he is. The final weekend before the trial began, I returned to Dorothy and Frank Manning's farmhouse, where my recovery had started. It felt appropriate to spend these last days of preparation in the place where I'd first begun to understand my own strength and resilience. Elena, you've come so far from the terrified woman who knocked on our door that night, Dorothy observed as we sat on her porch watching the sunset. You've transformed something horrible into an opportunity to protect other people and hold dangerous criminals accountable. Frank had been following the case closely through his law enforcement contacts, and he was confident that the prosecution had built an unshakable case. Elena, the evidence is overwhelming, he assured me. The financial records, the fake medical facility, the criminal network, the forensic evidence. Marcus and his co-conspirators are going down, and they're going down hard. That night, I reviewed my testimony one final time, making sure I could recount every detail clearly and calmly. The woman who would take the witness stand was very different from the confused and terrified person who'd escaped from that abandoned hospital 6 months earlier. I was stronger, clearer, and absolutely determined to see justice served. The trial would begin in less than 48 hours, and I was ready to face Marcus in court and tell the world exactly what he'd tried to do to me. My testimony would help ensure that he and his criminal associates would never harm another innocent person, and that other potential victims would understand that escape and justice were both possible. Part 5. The Resolution and New Beginning. The federal courthouse in Sacramento buzzed with activity as photographers and reporters lined the steps leading to the main entrance. Today marked the beginning of what media outlets were calling the trial of the decade, a case that had exposed a sophisticated criminal network operating across multiple states and claiming innocent lives for financial gain. I walked through the crowd flanked by Rebecca Martinez and Agent Santos, wearing a charcoal gray suit that projected strength and credibility without drawing unnecessary attention. Inside the courtroom, I got my first glimpse of Marcus in over 4 months. He sat at the defense table looking gaunt and defeated, a sharp contrast to the confident physician I'd once been married to. His expensive suit couldn't hide the toll that months in federal custody had taken on him. When our eyes met briefly across the courtroom, I felt nothing but cold recognition. This man had orchestrated my intended murder with the same clinical precision he brought to cardiac surgery. Rebecca's opening statement was methodical and devastating. She walked the jury through the timeline of Marcus's criminal conspiracy, from the initial insurance fraud through the elaborate network of fake medical facilities designed to commit undetectable murders. Her presentation was enhanced by charts, photographs, and financial records that painted an undeniable picture of calculated evil. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about the ultimate betrayal of trust, Rebecca began, facing the 12 individuals who would decide Marcus's fate. Elena Rodriguez trusted her husband to protect her when she was most vulnerable, battling cancer. Instead, Marcus Chen saw her diagnosis as a business opportunity and began planning her death with the same methodical approach he brought to his medical practice. The defense attorney, a high-priced criminal lawyer named Jonathan Pierce from San Francisco, attempted to portray Marcus as a devoted husband whose judgment had been clouded by desperation and grief over his wife's diagnosis. He suggested that what appeared to be a murder conspiracy was actually a series of tragic misunderstandings compounded by my supposed psychological instability from cancer treatment. My client is a respected cardiac surgeon who has saved hundreds of lives throughout his career, Pierce argued in his opening statement. The prosecution wants you to believe that this dedicated physician suddenly became a calculating killer, but the evidence will show that Mrs. Chen's perceptions were distorted by the trauma of her diagnosis and the psychological effects of her treatment. The prosecution's case unfolded over 2 weeks of testimony that systematically destroyed any possibility that Marcus's actions could be explained as innocent mistakes. The evidence was presented in careful sequence, building from financial fraud through conspiracy and culminating in attempted murder. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic accountant, spent 3 days walking the jury through computer printouts and financial records that documented years of systematic theft and fraud. Her testimony revealed that Marcus had been stealing from our joint accounts and using my identity for unauthorized transactions long before my cancer diagnosis, suggesting that my murder had been planned as the culmination of a long-term financial exploitation scheme. The defendant systematically diverted funds from joint accounts, opened credit lines using his wife's identity, and made financial commitments that would have left Mrs. Chen's estate responsible for over $800,000 in debt, Jennifer testified. This pattern of financial abuse created powerful economic incentives for ensuring that Mrs. Chen died, rather than recovered from her illness. Dr. Williams testified about Marcus's unusual behavior during my cancer treatment, particularly his persistent questions about terminal complications and his resistance to positive developments in my recovery. Her medical records provided a detailed account of his attempts to undermine legitimate treatment, while positioning himself to suggest alternative approaches. The defendant repeatedly inquired about worst-case scenarios and end-stage complications that weren't relevant to Mrs. Chen's actual medical condition, Dr. Williams explained to the jury. His questions were more consistent with someone planning for a patient's death than someone hoping for their recovery. He seemed disappointed when I provided positive updates about her progress. Agent Torres presented evidence about the abandoned hospital and the broader criminal network that had been operating across multiple states. His testimony included photographs, floor plans, and forensic analysis that demonstrated how the facility had been designed specifically to facilitate murders, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate medical care. The defendant transported his wife to a facility that had no legal authority to provide medical treatment, where she would have been given fatal doses of medication by unlicensed personnel operating under false identities, Agent Torres testified. This was not a misguided attempt to find experimental treatment. This was a carefully orchestrated plan to cause Mrs. Ma Chen's death in a way that would appear to be a tragic medical complication. The most shocking testimony came from Dr. James Richardson himself, who had agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a plea agreement that spared him from the death penalty. His matter-of-fact account of the criminal network's operations and Marcus's role in multiple murders was delivered in a flat, emotionless voice that made his words even more chilling. The defendant contacted me through intermediaries in the spring, explaining that his wife had cancer and substantial life insurance coverage, Richardson testified. He wanted her death to appear to be the result of complications from experimental cancer treatment, so that insurance investigators wouldn't question the claim or delay payment. Richardson's testimony included details about the specific medications that had been prepared for me, powerful sedatives and cardiac drugs that would have caused organ failure within days if I'd continued taking them as prescribed. The autopsy would have shown complications consistent with advanced cancer, rather than deliberate poisoning. The plan was for Mrs. Chen to deteriorate rapidly after beginning our treatment protocol, Richardson continued. Her death would have been attributed to an aggressive cancer progression that overwhelmed experimental therapy, with her husband appearing to be a grieving widower who had tried everything possible to save her. When my turn came to testify, I felt surprisingly calm and focused despite the gravity of the moment. Rebecca had prepared me thoroughly, and I understood that my role was simply to tell the truth about what had happened, and let the jury draw their own conclusions about Marcus's guilt. I testified about the gradual changes in Marcus's behavior after my diagnosis, his persistent efforts to undermine my confidence in conventional treatment, and his insistence on finding alternative options that seemed too good to be true. I described the abandoned hospital, the suspicious medications, and the pre-signed discharge papers that had first alerted me to the true nature of the situation. When I saw those discharge papers with the next day's date already filled in before I'd even begun treatment, I realized that Marcus hadn't brought me there to save my life, I testified, looking directly at the jury. He'd brought me there to end it in a way that would look like a medical complication rather than murder. The defense cross-examination was aggressive but ultimately ineffective. Pierce tried to suggest that my perceptions had been distorted by medication and psychological trauma, but my testimony remained consistent and was supported by overwhelming physical evidence that couldn't be explained away by claims about my mental state. Mrs. Chen, isn't it possible that the stress of your cancer diagnosis caused you to misinterpret your husband's well-intentioned efforts to find you the best possible treatment? Pierce asked during a particularly aggressive exchange. No, Mr. Pierce, I replied calmly. I was certainly frightened by having cancer, but my thinking was completely clear. The evidence speaks for itself. The insurance fraud, the fake medical facility, the unauthorized medications designed to kill me. These aren't misinterpretations or stress reactions. These are documented facts that prove my husband was trying to murder me. My parents testified about Marcus's suspicious interest in our family's financial situation and his detailed questions about inheritance planning and business succession. Their testimony helped establish that his interest in my death extended beyond just insurance benefits to include the substantial inheritance I would receive from their restaurant empire. Marcus asked very specific questions about our estate planning and what would happen to our business assets if something happened to Elena, my father testified with barely controlled anger. At the time, we thought he was being responsible about financial planning. Now we understand he was calculating the total value of our daughter's death. The prosecution's final witness was Dr. Patricia Morrison, the forensic psychologist who had evaluated me during trial preparation. Her testimony effectively countered the defense claims about my mental state, while providing expert analysis of Marcus's behavior patterns and criminal psychology. Mrs. Chen shows no evidence of psychological impairment, delusional thinking, or memory problems related to her cancer treatment, Dr. Morrison testified. Her account of events is consistent, logical, and supported by extensive physical evidence. In contrast, the defendant's behavior shows classic patterns of intimate partner abuse, financial exploitation, and predatory planning. The defense case was brief and largely ineffective. Pierce called character witnesses who testified about Marcus's reputation as a physician and his apparent devotion to me during our marriage, but their testimony was completely undermined by the overwhelming evidence of his criminal planning and participation in multiple murders. Marcus himself did not testify, probably because his attorneys understood that cross-examination would have been devastating. There was simply no way to explain away the insurance fraud, the fake medical facility, the criminal network connections, and the systematic financial abuse that had been documented so thoroughly by federal investigators. Rebecca's closing argument was passionate and compelling, tying together all the evidence into a coherent narrative of betrayal, greed, and attempted murder that demanded the harshest punishment available under federal law. Elena Rodriguez trusted her husband with her life when she was fighting cancer, and Marcus Chen tried to use that trust to kill her for money, Rebecca concluded, facing the jury with righteous anger. She survived only because of her own courage and intelligence, and because good people believed her when she asked for help. Marcus Chen is not a devoted husband who made tragic mistakes. He is a calculating predator who saw his wife's illness as an opportunity for profit, and he deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison. The jury deliberated for 8 hours over 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all federal charges. Marcus was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and multiple counts of identity theft. The racketeering conviction alone carried a potential sentence of life in prison, without the possibility of parole. When the verdicts were read, Marcus showed no visible emotion, staring straight ahead as if he'd already mentally disconnected from the proceedings. I felt a profound sense of relief and vindication as each guilty verdict was announced. The justice system had worked exactly as it should, protecting innocent victims and holding dangerous criminals accountable for their actions. Outside the courthouse, I was surrounded by reporters, asking about my reaction to the verdicts and my plans for the future. With Rebecca's guidance, I gave a brief statement that focused on the broader implications of the case, rather than my personal feelings about Marcus's conviction. Today's verdicts send a clear message that sophisticated criminal conspiracies targeting vulnerable people will be investigated thoroughly and prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law, I said to the assembled media. I hope that other potential victims will see this case and understand that they have options, that they can seek help, and that they can hold their abusers accountable through the legal system. The sentencing hearing 6 weeks later was the final chapter in the legal proceedings. Pierce made predictable arguments for leniency, citing Marcus's previous contributions to medicine and his lack of prior criminal history, but Judge Catherine Morrison was clearly unimpressed by their appeals. Dr. Chen, you exploited your medical knowledge and your wife's trust in the most calculating way imaginable, Judge Morrison said before imposing sentence. You participated in a criminal conspiracy that claimed multiple innocent lives, and you would have succeeded in murdering your own wife if not for her courage and the intervention of law enforcement. The court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As I left the federal courthouse after sentencing, I felt like I was finally closing the door on the most traumatic chapter of my life. Marcus would spend the rest of his days in federal prison, the criminal network had been dismantled, other potential victims had been protected, and I was free to rebuild my life according to my own values and priorities. The civil litigation that followed resulted in the recovery of most of the money Marcus had stolen, plus substantial damages from the insurance companies that had been defrauded. The financial settlement provided me with resources to start completely over, without any dependence on assets that had been tainted by his criminal activities. 1 year after the trial ended, I was living in a renovated farmhouse in Mendocino County, California, working as a freelance graphic designer while pursuing my passion for landscape photography. The property included 20 acres of rolling hills and oak trees, providing the peace and privacy I needed to continue my healing process. The cancer treatment that Dr. Williams had prescribed was working exactly as she'd predicted, and my latest scans showed no evidence of disease. My health had actually improved significantly since escaping from Marcus's control, suggesting that the stress of living with a potential murderer had been affecting my recovery more than I'd realized at the time. Dorothy and Frank Manning had become surrogate family members, visiting regularly and maintaining the close bond we'd developed during my recovery. They'd literally saved my life by believing my story and helping me when I was most vulnerable, and their friendship had become one of the most valuable relationships in my new life. Elena, you've built something beautiful here, Dorothy observed during one of their visits as we sat on my deck overlooking the valley. You took the worst thing that could happen to a person and transformed it into a new beginning that's entirely your own. My relationship with my parents had been strengthened by the ordeal. They'd been devastated to learn how close they'd come to losing their daughter to someone they'd trusted and welcomed into our family. But they'd also gained a new appreciation for my strength and independence. The restaurant business was thriving under their continued leadership, and they'd updated their estate planning to include additional protections against financial exploitation. The victim advocacy work I'd begun during my recovery had evolved into a formal consulting role with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. My experience provided valuable insights into sophisticated fraud schemes and the psychology of predators who target vulnerable individuals for financial gain. Elena, your case has revolutionized how we investigate these complex conspiracies, Agent Santos told me during one of our regular consultations. Prosecutors and investigators across the country are using your case file as a training model for recognizing and building cases against similar criminal networks. The book I'd written about my experience had been published to critical acclaim and commercial success. Prescribed Betrayal: How I Survived My Husband's Plan to Kill Me had spent several weeks on bestseller lists and was being used by law enforcement agencies, victim advocacy groups, and medical professionals to understand and prevent similar crimes. Elena, your story is saving lives, my literary agent told me during our latest conversation. We're getting reports from readers who recognized similar patterns in their own relationships and sought help before becoming victims themselves. The photography exhibition I'd mounted at a gallery in San Francisco had been surprisingly successful. with several pieces selling to collectors who appreciated the themes of resilience and renewal that characterized my work. The centerpiece was a series of sunrise photographs taken from my farmhouse, representing the daily opportunity for fresh starts and new beginnings. 2 years after Marcus's conviction, I received word that Richardson had died in federal prison from complications related to his advanced age and poor health. His death effectively ended the criminal network that had claimed at least a dozen innocent lives over 5 years of operation. The romantic relationship I'd developed with Michael, a fellow photographer I'd met through the local arts community, was progressing slowly and carefully. After Marcus's betrayal, I was naturally cautious about trusting anyone with intimate access to my life, but Michael's patience and consistency were gradually earning my confidence. "Elena, I understand why you need to take things slowly," Michael told me during one of our evening walks through the hills near my property. "What you survived would make anyone careful about trust. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm happy to build our relationship at whatever pace feels right to you." The third anniversary of my escape from the abandoned hospital had become a personal holiday that I observed with quiet reflection and gratitude. Each year, I returned to visit Dorothy and Frank, bringing flowers to place at the spot where I'd first knocked on their door asking for help. "Elena, you've turned your greatest trauma into your greatest strength," Frank observed during our anniversary visit. "That takes a special kind of character that most people never have to discover in themselves." The foundation I'd established with part of my civil settlement was providing grants to victims of intimate partner violence and financial abuse, particularly those facing medical crises that made them vulnerable to exploitation. The Elena Rodriguez Foundation had already helped over 200 families escape dangerous situations and rebuild their lives. My health continued to improve steadily, with regular checkups showing that the cancer remained in complete remission. Dr. Williams had remained involved in my care through referrals to specialists in Northern California, and she continued to be amazed by both my physical and emotional recovery. "Elena, you're one of the most resilient people I've ever treated," Dr. Williams told me during our latest consultation. "You faced down both cancer and a calculating murderer, and you've emerged from both challenges stronger and healthier than ever." As I sat on my deck watching another magnificent sunset over the Mendocino Hills, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment of peace and contentment. Marcus had brought me to that abandoned hospital intending to end my life for financial gain, but instead, he'd inadvertently given me the opportunity to discover who I really was when everything else was stripped away. The woman who'd trusted blindly and nearly died for it was gone forever, replaced by someone who trusted wisely and lived authentically. Marcus's plan had failed completely, not just because I'd escaped, but because the life I'd built afterward was infinitely better than anything he could have destroyed. The final chapter of my book had concluded with reflections on the nature of trust, resilience, and recovery that had become my guiding principles. I'd learned that survival was only the first step in healing from profound betrayal, and that true recovery required building a life based on your own values rather than trying to return to what had existed before the trauma. "Sometimes the people who try to destroy us end up setting us free," I'd written in that final chapter. Marcus wanted to kill me for money, but he accidentally gave me the chance to become someone stronger, more authentic, and more purposeful than I'd ever been while living under his control. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky as I finished my evening reflection. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new challenges, and new possibilities for growth and contribution. But tonight, I was simply grateful to be alive, to be free, and to be exactly who I was meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.